Well, good evening, and thank you again for joining us tonight in our Bible study, our live stream Bible study. We're starting something new, and I'm really excited about it. It's a survey of the book of Exodus. Now, usually we'll talk about a book as a survey whenever we are asking you to do the reading at home so that we can come back and talk about it, kind of to pull the important points out of it and to understand things better. And our assignment tonight was to read Exodus chapter 1 and chapter 2. And the purpose there was in order for us to grab an understanding of the things that would set us up for the book of Exodus. I'm really excited about this study because Exodus is such a profoundly important book. You're going to be amazed how much New Testament teaching comes out of the book of Exodus, that the book of Exodus is directly tied to. You really need to understand the book of Exodus to understand, for example, Paul's big points on sin in Romans chapter 6, or the characteristics of God, or the nature of law, or all sorts of things that are established here that are profitable for us as New Testament Christians. So I'm really excited about the book, talking about these things, talking about some of my favorite people in the Bible, as we study Moses and his story as it begins here. Now, you probably know Exodus was most likely written by Moses. We typically consider that the first 5 books were written by Moses and perhaps abridged or put together by Joshua, because the last book actually encounters the death of Moses. But we also understand that the point of these books is Genesis tells the history of the world and Abraham in particular to get us up to the Israelites being brought into Egypt. And the Israelites are brought into Egypt just as about, I just forgot the exact number. Maybe somebody can throw it in the chat if you remember. Was it 120 people total were the total of the Israelites, the 12 sons of Jacob that went into Egypt, and they did so in order that they could be preserved. I tell you what, that's a question we're going to come back to here in just a couple of moments. And Exodus chapter 1 brings us up to a point where we start to find out that time in Egypt, as they have grown, things have both gone well and gone badly for them. You remember how it was that Joseph was the prime minister of Egypt, meaning he was the top visor, the top official there. And he had brought his family in because he knew that there was an opportunity. There was something that the Egyptians absolutely hated. They hated sheep. I don't know what to think of that, but the word used in the book of Genesis is abomination to describe that. Teresa's got the right answer. It wasn't 120, it was 70. Thanks, Teresa. Count yourself the winner of tonight's Brian Point. That's worth exactly what you think it is, and I appreciate you grabbing that. Oh, Stan got it too. Stan's second there, but the award's already been given out, so I appreciate that. But thanks, Stan. Thanks, Teresa, getting that number right, 70 people. And of those that went in, they went in as shepherds. Another thing the Egyptians actually also considered it an abomination to eat with the Israelites. And if you remember, Joseph at one point, his brothers are there, and he has to go off to eat by himself because of that taboo. Kind of interesting thing about the Egyptians. They're the most powerful society in the world, by the way. There's really nobody like them. They're such an unusual civilization in history that the study of that civilization isn't just a history study. It's called Egyptology because it's so unusual. Now, they didn't call themselves Egyptians. That's actually a Greek word, believe it or not. And that Greek word is where the word gypsy comes from, another misnomer that's a misunderstood idea. But they understood themselves a little bit differently. And when the Bible talks about them, it would use the word Mizraim to talk about them and to identify this group of people. And the area of Mizraim that the Israelites lived in was the northern area called Goshen. Well, as we kind of pick ourselves up here and remember the things, let's kind of do an overview before we get to our questions and start talking about what you read. Now, Israel was in Egypt. That's what it tells us beginning in chapter 1. It talks about the children of Israel who came in there. And it talks about how there was a new king that arose. I tell you what, I'm just going to throw the passage out there for you to look at there. The new king, verse 8, rose in Egypt who did not know Joseph. So right away, we've got the beginning of our problem there. He's afraid because of the growth of the Israelite nation. He says, look, the people of children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Let's deal shrewdly with them lest they multiply, and it happened in the event of war, they join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. So they begin this terrible burden. Verse 11 talks about the cities that they forced them to build. But it didn't stop them. They grew more afflicted. They abused them more, and the Egyptians were harder and harder, making bricks and all manner of service, it says. And then it gives us this most terrible of commandments. The king of Egypt, in verse 16, says to the midwives of Israel, and it identifies them as two women in particular, whenever a son is born, you are to kill him. It's really a horrible thing that he's doing. The word that was coined in the 20th century is genocide, when you're trying to kill a group of people or reduce a group of people because of their ethnicity. That really well applies here to what's going on. They want to reduce the Israelite population, particularly of the men, so they order these women to start killing babies. So when we think about Israel here in their circumstance, one of the questions that sometimes comes up is, how long is it that they have been there? Going back to our post we had just a second ago. Well, it's kind of, believe it or not, that's actually not an easy question to answer. At first you might think, well, this isn't hard, because in Genesis 15 and verse 13, it very clearly says that 400 years were going to pass in the time that they would be in captivity. And in Acts chapter 7, as they're talking there, it's Stephen talking in Acts 7. He says it's 400 years as well. So you think, well, there's our answer. And Paul says 430 years. You might think, well, that was rounded. On the other hand, though, when we actually look through the book of Exodus, it records for us 4 generations of people there. So it's a little bit confusing how that time is counted. I've seen some marvelous studies by men a lot smarter than me that have worked out how that timeline is established. But sometimes it's a little confusing. Trying to find the times of the Exodus are a little bit difficult to understand. And it's really not that important, frankly, apart from the fact that God had established what was going to happen. And at the same time, God had made it clear that that captivity period was going to come to an end even before it had started. It wasn't that unusual that God should make a prophecy like this. You know, I've been studying with George the book of Isaiah. And one of the interesting things about Isaiah is a lot of Isaiah is a prophecy about an event that the event that gets that one started, the defeat of Israel, was still a century away, and he was talking about their release after that. So whenever God told Abraham, I'm going to set your people free from Egypt, certainly that didn't make a lot of sense to him, and yet we want to understand that this was God's plan all along. Now this Pharaoh leads to this murder, and he begins this terrible ordeal of killing everybody. And of course, the midwives are saying, "Oh, we can't do it. They're not going to do it." It says God blesses them for that. Here in just a couple of moments, that'll lead us to one of our questions that we want you to think about the morality of this issue. And I don't want to make it think that this sounds like a very dubious or questionable thing. I don't think there's a complicated answer here. But the point is that these women, these midwives, start saving the children by saying, well, we can't do anything about it. They're having them too fast for us to even stop. Pharaoh makes a second command, though, right? At the end of the chapter 1, he says, I want every son born cast into the river. So whether they survive childbirth or not, he says, I want them cast out into the river. So first he commanded them to abort these children, or to make sure they were dead at birth. And now if they even survive, you're supposed to go find these children and start killing them, throwing them into the river. It's a horrific commandment. I use the word abort because I maybe want you to think of some of the characteristics in our society today and how wicked that is. By the way, as a side note, sometimes it talks about the king of Egypt, like there in verse 18, sometimes about Pharaoh in verse 22. They're the same person. The word Pharaoh is just a kind of interesting that the Bible uses it because it's an Egyptian word, and it's an Egyptian word that means the great house. And the Pharaoh was effectively the ruler of the great house of Egypt, and he was the king of Egypt. So hopefully that's not confusing to you as we consider that. And that takes us on to chapter 2. And as we go into chapter 2, we come very personally to the man Moses. And it tells us about Moses' heritage. Moses is of the tribe of Levi. And the first thing we know about him in verse 2 is that he is a beautiful child. He's a beautiful child. So a big idea is that as this child is born and they know they can't hide him after 3 months, they come up with this plan. They're going, and this is well, I'd say crazy, but it's actually just a lot of faith. They're going to put him in a basket. And by the way, let's use the word that the Bible uses, an ark. And if you ever have heard, there are 3 arks in the Bible. There is Noah's ark, and then Moses' ark here, and then the Ark of the Covenant. And those are the 3 arks. The word ark just means a box. So get the idea that this is just a wicker basket or a wicker box, and they've smeared it with asphalt, which is kind of neat because, the Ark of Noah was also covered like this too. And they push him out into the river. And the sister we're not being told about too much yet. This is Miriam, is along the bank there, and she's watching, and she is making sure that there's a lot of dangerous things in that river. But ironically, it drifts in verse 5 right up to the home of Pharaoh's daughter, where she's gone to take a bath. And so as it drifts up there, Miriam sees the baby. Remember, he's beautiful. And it says he starts to cry. The baby wept, and she's just stricken in the heart. The Bible says she has compassion, but she knows right away he's a Hebrew. Now, I've always wondered about her looking at the child, knowing he's a Hebrew, knowing her father has said, hey, all the Hebrew babies, all the Hebrew boys have to die. And she decides she's going to take this child. Verse 10 would tell us that the child is brought, I'll throw that up for you to look at, that the child was brought into the home of Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So Moses grows up in the home of Pharaoh. It's kind of interesting in Acts chapter 7, that's an interesting passage to look at, but in Acts chapter 7, it says that Moses was educated in all the knowledge of the Egyptians. Now that's a big deal, by the way. Doesn't mention it here because all we have in his growing up is verse 10, him being named, and verse 11, him being 40 years later an adult, as Stephen would tell us. But that concept of being educated in the knowledge of the Egyptians is actually tremendous. It's actually really important. The Egyptians had a school or had an education system at that time, and nobody else in the world did. And there's one story, for example, that's been discovered that the Hittites, who were a great nation at that time, they sent their princes to Egypt to be educated in these schools because these schools were the best. The Egyptian language written down was not written with an alphabet. In fact, there was no such thing as an alphabet at that time. Instead, there were hieroglyphics of types. And so this writing, and by the way, that's gonna be something important to talk about in the coming chapters, and probably about 2 months from now. We're gonna come back to that little tidbit about no alphabet existing, because the alphabet's just about to be invented, and you're never gonna believe who invents it. But we'll come back to that later. But the point is, right now, this is the best place to go to be taught of the greatest things to know. A little later on, it'll be Babylon, and we know Daniel rises in that knowledge. But right now, Moses has been educated in the top education that he can have. And what happens? You remember the next part of the story? Well, I'll tell you what, we'll let Stephen summarize it for us. That is to say, Stephen, one of the 7, before we go there, let me look at Hebrews chapter 11. I got my passages mixed up where I wanted to go. In Hebrews chapter 11, it tells us this. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. For he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. It's kind of interesting, by the way. He saw him who was invisible. That that could be if there was a biography written of Moses' life, that would be a great subtitle. Moses, he who saw him who was invisible. That's a pretty cool little thing there to think about. But the second passage I want you to consider is the statement that's made in Acts chapter 7 by Stephen, who summarizes these next parts very succinctly. He says, when he was 40 years old, that's Moses, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel, and seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed and struck down the Egyptian. So what we have here is that Moses, who comes out and he sees the predicament of his brethren, and he strikes the Egyptian. Moses, unfortunately, is betrayed and has to flee away. And in verse 15, it tells us that he, because Pharaoh wanted to kill him. By the way, that's kind of interesting because you wonder what the relationship of Moses and this Pharaoh were. If Pharaoh has been raised by the daughter of the last Pharaoh, the Pharaoh who in Acts we're told had died, then maybe, has this man been raised like a brother to him or an uncle or something like that? It might have been a rather personal relationship. It's hard to say. The Bible doesn't seem to tell us what their relationship must have been. I know there's a lot of stories, movies and stuff that have speculated about them having a relationship, and it very well could be. It actually would make a lot of sense. But he flees away to the land of Midian. And in the land of Midian, of course, this is where he meets his wife, his future wife, Zipporah, and he meets his future father-in-law, Jethro. And in meeting these two people, one of the interesting things is that he taking these things, meeting these people, he's going to meet people that are people of God. Now, I'm going to ask the question here in just a little bit about the Midianites and who the Midianites were. Along the lines of Daniel being taken, I see Stan has got a comment in chat already. Stan says, during the captivity of the children of Israel, the king, and by the way, this actually refers to the king of Babylon. Stan's referring to the king of Babylon, which in Daniel chapter 1, it tells us this. The king took the best educated people from Israel to his kingdom. So Stan's reminding us in Daniel chapter 1 that again, it was no longer Egypt that was the center of knowledge, but it was Babylon. So that's a good point for us to consider. For the next 40 years, he's going to dwell in the land of Midian as, believe it or not, a shepherd. That's kind of an interesting thing to think about because he's been raised in the home of the Egyptians. And remember, we've said that the Egyptians, they rather despise the idea of sheep. And that's, just something I've always thought was kind of interesting to consider, that while they despise sheep, that ultimately this man is going to go out and he's going to become himself a shepherd. And that's what he's going to do for the next 40 years. And it's kind of important, by the way, to put that together, that he is 40 years old when he flees Egypt. He is 40 years old whenever, he is 40 years old, 40 years later after this. So he's going to be 80 years old at the time that these things come about. I'm going to see if I can pull up a picture here of the area of, it doesn't look like I'm going to be able to. I wanted to show you a picture really quickly of the area of Midian to give you a sense of where he was. And to some degree, the idea of Midian is not entirely known. Here we go. So I've got a little bit of a map here for you to consider. As you look at this map, you see Midian way down south of what is Israel. You know that Israel was up in this area. And it comes down here to Midian, which is the place where he's going to live with his father-in-law, Jethro. So these are the things that we are considering in his life and what he does. Got a couple of comments I'm going to grab here really quickly. First of all, I've got a comment from Stephen James. Stephen says, Moses as a shepherd seems to have been symbolic of Christ, our shepherd. What's interesting about that, Stephen, is that when I consider your comment there, I'm thinking about the idea that I remember years ago, it was said that Moses spent the first 40 of his years in an academic training and then spent the next 40 years in vocational training to lead Israel. And to be a shepherd was ultimately his work for Israel. So like you say, Jesus, the great shepherd, Moses and he have a lot in common, we'll be finding out in the study of Exodus, and so that's a good point. Very important point we're going to come to here in just a moment, and that's going to be a question of who are the Midianites. And Teresa's got an answer for us. I see Stan's got another answer for us too. I'm going to hold your answers till we get to that question, and that's okay that they're ready to go. I'm glad for that. That's one of the ideas of having the questions ahead of time. You don't have to sit there and think about it. You can have them written down and just drop them out there for us to consider as we look at these things. As we move forward, our first questions are this. Questions number 1. What is it that brought the children of Israel to Egypt in the first place? What was it that motivated them to leave? Now, I'll remind you that in the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, Abraham dwelt in Egypt for a brief time and then left. God told Isaac he was never to go to Egypt. I've always found that kind of interesting. God told Isaac he was never to go to Egypt, so Isaac never did. And instead, he dwelled in the land just like God told him he must. And then Jacob, of course, is the one who goes down there. Now, what is it that brought him that case? And before we get to those questions, and the second question about the Hebrew midwives, Lamar has a comment that I really like. Lamar says God used time, in other words, the length of time, for several leaders. Noah, 120 years. Moses 40 years, Abraham 25 years for his son, Joseph 14 years in prison. We should be patient and let God do his work with us. Lamar, that's a great comment. If I were going through that trial, I wouldn't think it was a great comment. I'd say that's just too long to wait. A lot of these people felt like it was too long to wait, and yet, Lamar, that's a great point. God uses time to prepare people for what it is that he has them to do. And that's an important thing for us to consider. So that's a really good comment about the length of time some men labored in serving God. I really appreciate that. So for the first question here, I've got out my answers already, Debbie and Monique and Teresa. The first thing was a famine. There was a great famine in the land. And it was interesting because it was a famine that Joseph had predicted. Joseph had predicted, because of Pharaoh's dream of the 7 lean and the 7 fat, that there would be 7 good years and then 7 lean years. Joseph was then put in charge of preparing the land by taking in everything that was they could for these bounties and storehouses. Kind of cool. They found ancient storehouses all through Egypt, and I've always wondered, are these the ones that Joseph built? But these enormous storehouses they found could store enormous amounts, and Joseph did. Joseph stored up all of this grain, and then when the time came, Joseph actually enabled Pharaoh to buy his own country, meaning he became the de facto owner of all the properties because they used this grain to buy it. This kind of marks Egypt's one of their highest points in history during this time period, and how powerful they were. So it really is kind of interesting how Joseph did that. And as we see here, famine. And Monique adds one other thought. She says, and the reunification with Joseph, that's important too. But ultimately, and by the way, God told Jacob he could go. That was a dream that he had right before he left. It was one of the many times God appeared to Jacob, and God told Jacob, you can go to Egypt. And so he went to meet his son. So Teresa, Monique, Debbie, that's exactly right. Question number 2 was this. Was it right for the Egyptian midwives to lie about the birth of the Hebrew children? I don't know if that's a very fair question. And let me just say, maybe the answer to this isn't an easy answer, no matter what you think. Stan gave us an answer earlier. Stan said, we must obey God before we obey the government. Example of Daniel, Peter, the apostles, the 3 Hebrews who would not worship idols. So right off the top, Stan makes the point to us and says, we are not permitted to obey evil laws. If we are ordered to do something that is not right before God, we cannot obey it. That's an important thing for all of us to know. That's true in the Old Testament. In fact, one thing we're going to learn in the book of Exodus is not to speak evil of our leaders. But it's also true in the New Testament. Romans 13 tells us a great deal about that. So as Stan has made it clear, there is a limit to our obedience to the government. We're supposed to obey the government. We're supposed to be subject to the government, to pray for the government. But at the same time, if they order us to do something that is against God's law. Now, let's be careful to say, not against our law, against God's law, then we must obey God rather than men. That's the point we would consider. Let's kind of go to the answers. And George, you kind of gave me the answer I wanted right off the top, and I don't know if anybody else will say this too. George right off the top says lying is never acceptable. That's right. Fundamentally, this is a quandary because these women are being praised and God is going to bless them, and yet George is right when he says lying is never acceptable. And by the way, that's an Old Testament truth. That's not just something that Jesus taught us. Lying wasn't acceptable whenever Abraham did it or Isaac did it. Remember all the trouble that caused? Lying has always been an evil thing. Satan was a liar from the beginning. Lying, George says, is never acceptable. God hates lying, and he lists that in the 7 things God hates. But in this case, God did bless the midwives. So, interesting scenario here. Stephen James has a thought. He says, one thought is that this may not have been a lie per se. It seems at least plausible that the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, delayed getting to the Hebrew women just before they gave birth. Stephen, that's a great point. I actually hadn't thought about that. But that's really a possibility, right? That maybe they're just intentionally delaying, or, they're just intentionally avoiding these things and creating this scenario. That's a good point to consider. Lamar kind of points again to this idea that they fear God more than they fear Pharaoh. And that's right. That's exactly kind of what was said earlier when we made this point. What Stan said earlier, you must obey God rather than men. It's far more important to fear God than it is to fear Pharaoh. You're exactly right. Teresa says lying, maybe not, but it must have been God's will to prevent their deaths. So, that's a good point. That somehow this must be doing something that's God's will. Now, one more comment, and then I'll throw you my thoughts too. And I don't know that any of these, I don't know for sure that we know the answer exactly here. But we do know it's wrong to lie. It's a sin to lie. But we also know that it was right for them to save these children. Grant says the following: do we know that God had commanded the people not to lie at this point in time? It may be that the midwives did not know it was something God hated. And Grant, you're exactly right. While it's been inferred in Genesis that the lies that were told there before this time were true, Genesis hadn't been written yet. Genesis is probably written by Moses during the time of the Exodus. So their knowledge about God's feelings about this wouldn't have been as clear as us today. So maybe that all of the things you've said are really good, and maybe they kind of help us to figure this one out. I've often said that in the Old Testament, there's a lot of times where people did the right thing, but maybe what they did wasn't right by itself. And Jacob is a great example of this. Jacob wanting the birthright was something God praised him for. The way he got it, not so much. The way he got it was dishonest, but God was pleased that he desired so greatly the things of God, and God has praised Jacob for that. So we might consider that God isn't rewarding them for lying. He's rewarding them for fearing him and loving the children of Israel. And so that's the reward that they're receiving. Now, things have changed. In times past, in Acts chapter 17, Paul would say God winked at things like this in times past. He winked at the ignorance that people would have about God's will, but today there's no winking. Today we have to understand that there's no compromise to say, well, I can lie to the government if it's just for the right reason. We may have to suffer terribly because of it, but we're neither permitted to lie nor to, obey the government opposed to God. That can be a difficult thing sometimes. So let's understand this. The only reason I bring this up is I've heard some people say in the past that lying isn't always wrong, and that this is a good example of that. This is not a good example of that. This is a good example of people that fear God and are desperate to save children. It's not a good example how they did it. It's a good example that they did it, that they feared God, that they wanted these children said. And that's the thing that's really praiseworthy for us to consider. Great comments. I think everybody brought a good point for us to consider in what is, I say, a very difficult question. Let's go to some easy ones, shall we? Who are Moses' parents? It just kind of mentions in briefly where they're from here, but who are they? Who are these people here that we meet? And who are his older brother and sister? When can we get some names for these people as well? It's kind of a thing to wonder about who he's related to and who his brother, who's older by 3 years. And by the way, the sister hasn't been named yet. The brother hasn't been named yet. Monique knows that in Exodus 6 and verse 20, we read about Jochebed and Amram, the Levites who were his parents, righteous people. The Bible tells us that feared God. They were both Levites, and Stephen's got that point down too. So this is all important things for us to consider about the identity of God, or identity of Moses and his family. Now, third question. Oh, I'm sorry, nobody's got the second one yet. Who are his older brother and sister? And it's always possible that this is a different sister, but probably not. Probably not, since both the siblings that we meet later are identified as older siblings. This is probably those people that we're looking at here. His sister is Miriam, and his brother is Aaron. If I had extra credit here, I'd say, what is the New Testament equivalent of the name Miriam? And you could probably jump on that pretty quickly or guess it even if you didn't know. What's the New Testament equivalent of the name Miriam, I wonder? Well, if you think about that, let's go ahead and jump to this last question. And the last question is, what does the name Moses mean? What does the name Moses mean? Monique got it, by the way, as far as Miriam, Mary. Mary is the New Testament variation of that name, Miriam. So kind of interesting that Mary, Jesus' mother, was that. What does the name Moses mean? Moses means drawn out of. Now that's kind of interesting, by the way, and we're going to come back to this because it's kind of a big deal a little later. That's kind of a special name. It's not just like, I'm going to name him drawn out, because I drew him out. That name was actually the name of most of the rulers of Egypt. Like Tutmos. There's that word, Mos, or Moses, or Moses, or we say Ramses. A lot of Amenmos. A lot of Egyptian rulers had that name Mos, or Moses. And as Stephen James goes right to take us to Exodus 2 and verse 10, Grant also got it. Teresa, drawn from the water. So it's interesting how it is that this name comes out. But this wasn't just a name. This was actually a royal name. Now, typically you would be named for some god. So if you were out of Ra, you were Ramses. Or if you were out of Tut, you were Tutmos. Amenmos, that you would be identified with a god. So she says you're out of the river. Well, that's kind of interesting. It's going to get a lot more interesting a little later on. This is actually going to be kind of a big deal in a few chapters whenever Moses comes back home and meets up with Pharaoh again. That name is going to be rather significant. But at this point, he's just Moses, just out of. And we don't yet know what he is out of. So let's go on looking at these questions. Got some more questions, and the question is, how was Moses raised? Dan, I think you already jumped on this one. I appreciate that. Moses spent some time with his mother in the early years. Now, how long? Well, I guess you got a question mark there. We don't really know how long, and it's not exactly clear. We know though that till he was 40 was when the book of Hebrews says he rejected that Egyptian heritage. But at that time, there's kind of a question there about how long he was there. He was raised in the Egyptian courts. Of course, some of the other things to consider is some of the usual circumstances. Remember what his sister did for him whenever he was there. See if somebody has that point about what his sister then provided for him. Kind of an interesting scenario here. You put the baby in the basket, send it down the river, and you're found by a princess, and she raises you as your son. Teresa's got the point I was looking about. His mother was his nurse for the first few years, his biological mother. That's really extraordinary. that all of this would work out where not only does the mother get her child back, but she's actually going to be paid to raise him. That's really an incredible scenario that comes out of this. But Teresa, you're right. His mother was his nurse for the first few years, so she probably taught him who he was and about the Hebrews. So that coming along to our second, our second point here in just a second. And Stephen, you got that one right too. From Exodus 2 verses 7 through 10, it seems clear that Moses' real mother, Jochebed, nursed him. And Stephen, you're grabbing the part I think is remarkable and was paid to do it. Debbie, you've got this one too. He was with his mother to be nursed and taken care of. So Debbie has the idea maybe about 3 years until he was weaned would make sense too. So all of that kind of goes to answer this question, and that's a really unusual situation, and it might kind of go on to answer this second question. Did Moses know he was a Hebrew? I actually think it's kind of an easy answer, but it does kind of strike me to think about for a moment, and I think, as I said, Teresa might have a good answer for that when she said that since his mother nursed him for the first few years, she was probably taught him who he was and about the Hebrews, the Hebrew people, and about God. So that's a very likely scenario. We've got some better answers than that as we go on. Stan just says yes. Well, Stan, I agree, but there's a couple of good reasons why we might think that. Number one, I think Teresa's point is a good one. He was, in fact, to a degree, raised by his real Hebrew mother, so it seems to me that wouldn't have slipped by in an opportunity to find that. Now, George actually goes to the passage that I wanted us to consider, and that's Acts chapter 7, where here in just a second, as we look at this, I want us to consider why it is that we might know that this is the case. Let me jump over there so I can share this passage with you. I should have put it up on our verses here. But let's go back to this thing that we saw just a moment ago when we were talking about him and Stephen's defense in Acts 7. And this is where in verse 22 it says, Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Now when he was 40 years old, look at this, it came to his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. So right away we have an indication here that at 40 he knew for certain he was a Hebrew. So there's no question that he knew he was a Hebrew. Maybe the question might be that he was not sure as to how long. Now we're going to pause, George, before we go much further than what we're seeing here. But certainly verse 24 leads us to see that he knew he was not an Egyptian. So that's a good point for us to consider as well, that we see here he was not understood he was not an Egyptian. Debbie makes the point that verse 11 there in Exodus 2 indicates it. Yes, it does. So the other answer I was thinking of too, Grant picked up on, that if the Egyptian was able to look at this baby and instantly know a 3-month-old was a Hebrew, it must be the case that the complexion of skin, probably, today the complexion of skin between Egyptians and people in Israel probably isn't that different, but then it might have been dramatically different. That if she could just look at the baby right away and say, that's a Hebrew child, probably Moses could too. Grant says, since Pharaoh's daughter knew immediately, they probably were obvious physical distinctions between Egyptians and Israel. That's right. That's right. So, there's a lot of speculation about the extent of those distinctions, and I think they're fascinating to think about. But, it's very likely that you could just look right away and say, that's not an Egyptian child. That's a Hebrew child. We see that that's exactly what happened. Now, there's an interesting point that Debbie and Barry bring up here. They say, his father might have taught him his heritage. That'd be interesting to consider. Did Amram get to teach his son much? I wonder about that. I really wonder about that. It's a really interesting thing to think about. And the comment is also made maybe a different way they dress too. And I would suggest that it's easy to distinguish the Hebrews from the Egyptians. As you say, the way they dress probably was a big part of that, and that would make sense too. So all of these are good points to say. Almost certainly he knew he was a Hebrew. There can almost be no question that all of his life, all of his life, he knew that he was a Hebrew. Our next question. Why did Moses attack the Egyptian? Now, in the text here, oh, by the way, I got one more point. D has a comment. D says, perhaps she knew he was a Hebrew because he was in a basket in the river because of her father's proclamation. D, I never thought of that. You guys think about what D said there. I never thought about that. They were supposed to throw babies in the river. So here's a baby in the river. Maybe that's the kicker. D, I've never thought about that. And I wonder if that kind of thwarts my thinking that she could know it was a Hebrew right away. I assumed it was his complexion or such. I hadn't really considered that it might have been that he's in the river. D, you might have just messed me up. That's a really good comment, though. Hadn't really considered that characteristic of the idea that they were the ones being thrown in the river. So that really is a good point to think about there. Why did Moses attack the Egyptian? Now, when we look at the text here, we do get some information right away. Verse 24 says, and if you're going to give me verse 24, I hope I'm not going to mess you up. Seeing one of them, the Israelites, suffering wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed and struck down the Egyptian. So verse 24 of Acts chapter 7 gives us a good answer. But I think verse 25 is the bigger answer. I tell you what, let's jump back to Exodus chapter 2 and grab this and see what's happening in verse 11 when it says that Moses was grown and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and when he saw no one, he killed him. It doesn't really tell us why he killed him there, but of course this answer in Acts 7 does. First of all, he says that when he saw this, he saw that it was wrong, and so he struck the Egyptian. Now, this may not exactly be the idea that Moses just jumped in there for trying to right a wrong. There's something else to this that goes on a little further. Why did Moses attack the Egyptian? And I think this is kind of an important point to consider. In fact, we're going to plug this in next time and talk a little bit about Moses' reluctance to lead Israel. And I'm going to say, there's a lot of good things to think about here as to what Moses' state of mind was at this moment. Well, let's read on together, and I'll be watching for your answers as they come up. Verse 25. Stephen James actually has an interesting point. He says, maybe he had seen this for a long time. That certainly seems a possibility. In fact, how could he not, right, Stephen? That's a real good point. How could he not have seen this all this time? So that's a really good point for us to consider. But verse 25 here in Acts 7 says that Moses supposed his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand. I put a lot of weight on that statement because it seems to me that in doing this, Moses is fulfilling what he thinks his purpose is. As the man who's the mediator between the Egyptian and the Hebrew, who's a man in two places at once, who's a man that's in two in two worlds at once. He's the man that's going to deliver them, and he presumes that the Hebrews must know this. So verse 25 seems to allude to the idea here that maybe Moses thinks, if I'll use the term revolution, now's the time for the revolution. Now's the time to raise up the Israelites and to have them leave with him, to save them, to deliver them. Of course, you and I know that that's not the case. And what goes on to happen here, but the Israelites reject him, verse 27, and threaten him, and verse 29 tells us that he has to flee. He has to flee this area, which brings us to our next question, by the way. How old was Moses when he fled from Egypt? I know I said it earlier, so if you want to throw that in there, we'll also take the question, who are the Midianites? Somebody answered that one earlier. Let me jump back and grab that real quick about the Midianites. I've got to scroll back just a little bit to find it, but somebody gave us a good answer. You know what? I thought I saw the answer earlier. Somebody had about the Midianites. Oh, here it is. Teresa gave us an answer about the Midianites. Teresa says, Midianites were descendants of Abraham and his wife Keturah. Midianites are descendants of Abraham and his wife Keturah. Sometimes, by the way, they're synonymous with the Moabites. That's kind of confusing because Moabites are descendants of Lot, but the Midianites are descendants of Abraham. So that's an important thing to think about with the Midianites. The Midianites are descendants of Abraham. And that's an important point for us to consider. So as we see here, these different people that are considered, I see Stan's got a comment here. Stan made the statement that during the time of the judges, the Midianites invaded and persecuted the children of Israel. So they're not exactly always friendly with Israel. Something is going to happen during the period in the wilderness with the Midianites that's going to raise a great enmity between these two nations. But at this point, that enmity doesn't yet exist. And so that's an interesting thing to question. That's an interesting thing for us to think about. Teresa's right to say Moses was 40 years old when he fled from Egypt, and the Midianites are descendants of Abraham. The Midianites are descendants of Abraham. By the way, these descendants of Abraham through Ishmael, a lot of these groups became the people that we identify today as the Arab peoples. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think of too. But Jethro, a Midianite, was a high priest, not a Jewish high priest, not a Hebrew high priest, but a high priest of God for the Midianite people. Kind of interesting though, a couple of things he'll say in conversations with Jethro is that he might not have been too knowledgeable about who God was and some of the characteristics about God. So as we kind of wrap up here, actually, Stephen, I see you got a point there about the Midianites, that they're characterized as the mother of the Arab nations. And as I said, that's oftentimes the consideration. The Arab peoples are mentioned for the first time, I think, in Ezra and Nehemiah. Before that, they're given some of the names of the descendants of Abraham and the Midianite people. So it does seem that the Midianites ultimately end up becoming the Arab peoples that we know today. Couple of questions as we wrap up our time together. First of all, what is Egypt meant to be a spiritual parallel for us? This is an important question. I'm sorry we're not spending more time and dedicating ourselves to it. But understanding Egypt is really important in this story. So Egypt is supposed to be what to us today? And I threw you one of many passages that talk about this, and it looks like you guys have already jumped onto this. George says Egypt represents the slavery of sin. Right out of Romans 6, right on, where it talks about we are slaves to sin. George says Egypt represents the slavery of sin. By their obedience, God's people were led out of sin into righteousness. The same is true today when we obey the gospel. George, that statement, the same is true today when we obey the gospel, that is the most important thing about the book of Exodus. This is our story too. This is your personal story, if you're in Christ, of how you left sin. And it's worth reading this story because while this was a historical event that genuinely happened 3,500 years ago, it's also an event that, in a metaphorical sense, occurred when you obeyed the gospel. George goes on to say this. He says another parallel is in Jude 5. And he says here, I want to remind you, brethren, that the Lord having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who do not believe. Now, George, what you're saying there is that Israel coming out of Egypt is a parallel. Now, George, that's also really important. And what's really neat about that statement is that what Jude says there is the same thing in a couple of weeks we're going to be talking about in 1 Corinthians 10, when Paul says this story, the story of the Exodus, was written for our understanding because he wants us to know that even after you're saved, you can lose your salvation. The story of Exodus is actually probably the most profound story of you're not once saved, always saved, but you can lose your salvation. That's a great point. I got a couple other comments here. Lamar says, the distance from Egypt to Midian was longer than Egypt to Canaan and did not take Moses 40 years to get there. So that's interesting to note. That is interesting to think about that. Maybe we'll come back to that point. In other words, they're going to take 40 years to get they're going to take 40 years to get there, but it's only a few days for Moses to get to Midian. They're going to take 40 years to get to Canaan. Midian's a lot farther. We need to know why that is, don't we? Teresa says it's to help us understand what being in bondage to sin is and what becoming free from sin that his bondage is like. Teresa, we could add to that what it costs, too. There's going to be some incredible things for us to think about in all this. Stephen James adds to that, it's the idea of sin and death. That's going to be a profound point for us to consider, too. Well, we're at our time. I've been thinking that one of the problems we're going to struggle with in our study is on time. There's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot to look at, and it gets busy next week, too. There's a lot of things we're going to try to cover to bring in. You guys have made some fantastic comments, though, about considering the things that we've looked at tonight. Exodus is about us. This is our story. And we want to understand it better so that we understand what our salvation cost and the dangers we face in this world, because they're the same ones Israel faced in a metaphorical sense as well. So thanks so much for all the great comments that we had and observations. I really appreciate that. Our class material is now on the website. You can take a look at that, download that information for the coming weeks. It's for all, I think I said 13 weeks, but it's actually 14 weeks that we have this class. And all the material is on the website at this time under our resources tab. Thanks so much for your time tonight. May God bless you in the remainder of your week.